Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to recommend a King's Indian defense repertoire for black. This is something that I've been meaning to do for a while because I'm trying to expand my repertoire and mainly motivated by my bad results against the King's Indian as white, I've decided to include the King's Indian in my own repertoire. If you want to learn this repertoire, the easiest way to do it is to play it out against somebody. So technically having a training sparring partner would be ideal if they want to play, white against your King's Indian. This is what Daniel and I are doing. In the absence of another human who wants to learn this, I would recommend Nocti. The repertoire is available on Nocti if you follow the link below. You can enter the repertoire. You can see that there are many variations. It goes a lot in depth, and Nocti is going to play white against you. If you select play opening, you can select Nocti's strength, select the time format, select the side, and play this out against Nocti as much as you want. Nocti is going to play like a human. It's of course going to stick to the repertoire that I've imported, that I've created, that you're going to see in the video. But once we exit theory, it's going to try to trick you, it's going to play uncommon ideas. If it's worse, it's going to play like a human. If it's better, it's not going to play perfectly. So it's almost like you're training against a human. Follow the link below, go to Nocti. If you decide to go premium and unlock all of Nocti's features, use the code Hanging Pawns to get a big 64% discount. The King's Indian Repertoire PGN is also available on my Patreon page, as well as many other repertoires, including E4, D4, the Vienna, the Colli, the Queen's Gambit, the Caro-Kann, the French, the Italian, many different PGNs. You can buy each one separately, and you can decide to support the channel for just $4 US a month, become a patron, and gain access to all the repertoires, as well as numerous other posts. I should say before we start that I've had help to do this. My friend Daniel, who plays the King's Indian almost exclusively against d4 and against most other things, has helped me with the classical variation. He recommended the Kazakh line with knight a6, and in the PGN you can find below, you can find Daniel's notes. He has experience in the opening, and he has also included about 6 games in the line. Now, before we continue, what's the King's Indian? If you don't know it, then you might want to check out the introduction to the King's Indian I have linked below. I will also link all the variations separately so you can watch detailed videos. And today I'm going to focus on ideas for black. In my other videos, I've tried to cover the King's Indian for both sides and give you a lot of theory. Today, I'm not going to be focusing on theory. I'm going to be focusing on plans, ideas, and some simple ways to refute or try to refute each line for white. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7. Now, I'm not going to talk about the sidelines such as the London or the Trompovsky or, the Reti, the English. What I am going to say is that you can play your setup, the setup you would like to achieve against anything white does, and you can play the King's Indian against virtually anything white could do. There is some theory, but generally against openings such as the London, if you just play a normal King's Indian, you should get a good position where you are relatively equal. Now, in the mainline King's Indian, where white plays d4, c4, and e4, the engine is always going to hate black. And I'm going to read you a note that Daniel wrote in his description of the Kazakh at the beginning of what he wrote in the PGN. He says, in my opinion, in order to play the King's Indian successfully, you have to accept that 1, white will always be a little better as per engine evaluation. That doesn't mean black is lost. 2, you have to have at least some idea of what types of positions you want to get and what kinds of patterns exist in those positions, since you are sacrificing the intuitiveness of a classical structure, such as the QGD, for the attacking potential and a 3-result game. I think this is a really good point. I've been playing the d4, d5 structures for a while, and even though I was almost never worse on move, let's say 10, regardless of my opponent's strength, many games have gone downhill because I hadn't had counterplay opportunities. 3. You have to be ready to sacrifice pawn structure or solidity for piece activity. I think this is another very strong point in favor of the King's Indian, although it might sound like the reverse of that. The King's Indian allows you to mess up your pawn structure, to have a weird structure, an unsafe structure, to have weaknesses, but you compensate for that with dynamic play and piece activity, which is why, Garry Kasparov played the King's Indian, Bobby Fischer played the King's Indian. Those guys were very strong tactically and dynamically. 4. You always have to be in a mindset to look for the initiative and present white with challenges. Nobody's going to play these structures as a computer. That means if black is at least somewhat prepared, black will get practical chances to outplay white in virtually any level of chess. Now what I'm going to say is that Daniel and I have played 2 games in the King's Indian, training games, in the last month or so. He has beaten me in both. In one of those games, I had a +3 advantage as white. In the second one, I had a +0.7 advantage out of the opening, and I lost both games. Now, that's mainly because Daniel is a stronger tactician than I, and he plays very dynamically. He's able to set, tactical opportunities, which I, in those 2 games, have fallen for. But also this proves that the King's Indian, despite being unsound according to the engine, or even if we go beyond that, once you get a huge advantage, there are still tactical tricks for black and ways to come up with counterplay that at least makes white's life harder. Okay, having said that, we are now going to start with the classical or the orthodox King's Indian, which is, still considered the main line. So after d6, white plays knight f3, black castles, and white goes bishop e2. Now what I'm going to say is that I prefer sidelines. As you may know, I have played the Semi-Averbakh, I have played the Makogonov, and I have played the Samisch. I have also played the Fianchetto Variation. I have many games in the sidelines against the King's Indian. I have never played the classical in a tournament game. I have played a couple in training games. Daniel says, in my opinion, the classical King's Indian is the best and most dangerous try that white can employ. White has done nothing wrong with their position, played intuitive solid moves, and is waiting to see what black will do. Now, the main move here is e5, of course, and e5 allows several different options for white that we are going to be avoiding with knight a6. Now, knight a6 has a couple of names, but we are going to call it the Kazakh variation because I like the name, and also Lichess calls it the Kazakh variation. So this is a positional move. The knight on c6 is placed aggressively, okay, and Daniel writes, there's no need to aggressively position the knight on c6 in order to go for the usual kingside pawn storm that's typically seen in these positions. Knight a6 is both engine approved and cuts down theory while giving black a playable position. The main idea is to play against b4. And after white castles, black plays e5. And now we get the typical King's Indian position where white advances with d5. Okay, and after white advances with d5, we get the c5 square for the knight. And once we get the c5 square for the knight, there's pressure on e4, and white needs to find a way to defend, so something like queen c2 or knight d2 eventually. And this, I think, is the most important position in the King's Indian. The knight is on c5, the pawn is on e5, and black has this pawn on d6, white has pawns on e4, d5, c4. Personally, this is what I get most of the time when I play white. And we are going to learn this in terms of patterns. You could reach this position via several different move orders, and you could reach this type of central structure with the knight on c5 in at least 5 out of the 9 variations. We're going to have a look at 10 variations. So what's the idea? This is something black can do when white castles kingside or queenside. In my opinion, this is stronger when white castles queenside. And black's idea is as follows. Black wants to play a5, and that's a pattern we see a lot in the Bogo Indian, Nimzo Indian with d6, e5, and basically we're playing against b4, because if we listen to the pawn structure, that's a term I like to use because you have to listen to your pawns. If you just draw the line following each side's pawn structure, it's very clear where the most natural pawn breaks are. Therefore, black in this case would like to play f5. Okay, you can also undermine the center with c6, but f5 and c6 are the ways to destroy the center. And white, listening to their pawn chain, should go c5. Now, in order to play c5, you have to play b4, otherwise the break is unsupported. But a5 prevents that. And after a5, white will have to resort to what I normally do in all of my King's Indian games, which is b3. And the reason we have to play b3 is we couldn't go a3, b4 in a single move because of en passant. We therefore have to play b3, a3, b4 to make en passant isn't allowed. So, for example, if white plays a3, then black can go a4, and after a4, black is much better on the queen side. Anything could happen in the center still, of course. However, white's c5 pawn break is not happening. It's not happening. And after b4, which would be a nice way to blunder, black takes en passant and the game is lost. Therefore, after a4, black has this cramp on the queen side. So white, instead of a3, plays b3. And now after something like, I don't know, knight h5, for example, if white goes a3, black can go f5, white's then gonna prepare b4 very slowly, watch out for the rooks hanging, but that's the main idea. Black's gonna play for f5, white's gonna play for b4. So that's sort of the type of structure we're trying to get. Now, white does not have to play d5 against knight a6 and e5. So I would advise you, if you play white against this, to not play d5 here. Let's just have a look at what happens if white tries to win a pawn. So we have to get this out of the way. If d5, then d5, and let's say they take on e5. Taking on e5 just loses the pawn on e4 because the knight on e5 is hanging. If they trade queens first and then take on, and then take on e5, then once again knight takes e4. So we're not losing a pawn. So that's one thing. Bishop e3 is, I think, the best way for white to play. And Daniel writes, the bishop is usually developed to the square supporting the c4, c5 expansion. There are two main moves here, either knight f6 to g4, harassing the bishop, or the move that I like and think is objectively stronger, queen e7. And then he says, in my view, the idea behind queen e7 is twofold. One, other than being a developing move which supports the center and possibly sets up tricks against the e4 pawn if white is not careful, and two, it's also a waiting move because black wants to close the center, because black wants white to close the center with d4, d5. So white can play d5, white can play d5 or queen c2 supporting their center, but d5 is sort of the thematic move we most often see. And now we can go knight g4. And now after the center is closed, black starts harassing that bishop. And bishop d2, I think, is, the best move, but f5 is coming. If bishop g5, then we can play f6, and after the bishop moves away to d2, then we can play f5. So this makes things very, very simple for black. When you close down the center with d5, it becomes very easy to play f5. And I keep repeating this. It's very similar to when white closes down the position with c5 in the Semi-Slav. That gives black a very easy time with e5. So that's just no good. On queen e7, if white just waits with rook e1, there's a trick here with knight e4. So I was actually aware of this. So after knight e4, e d4, bishop d4, there's queen e4, and black is just I think slightly better, but okay, bishop d3, queen g4, rook e4, queen d7, and so on. Queen c2 as a waiting move on queen e7 is playable, but we can just go ed4 again, and after knight d4 we can play c6, covering the d5 square, and we get a type of Maroczy bind position. I mean, put this pawn on e7, and it's just a standard dragon against the Maroczy bind. So I would say that these positions, especially after d5, are extremely pleasant to play. The reason the Kazakh is a good choice, and I can tell you this, Daniel and I played our last training game last Wednesday, so a couple of days ago. And I was looking at his online games, and he keeps playing this idea with knight a6. And I wanted to play the classical or the orthodox for the first time. But when I was studying the lines and, trying to prepare for white, I just couldn't find a way to get, not an advantage, the engine always says white's better, but I couldn't find a pleasant position I could play for. Because we get this typical knight on c5 with the pawn on a5. However, white doesn't have the standard kingside play you get in the, let's say, Semi-Averbakh or in the Samisch. Okay, so that's the classical. Now let's move on to the 4 pawns attack. So after d6, white has many options. Many options. Knight f3 commits to the classical most of the time. It could transpose to other lines, but now we are going to continue looking at alternatives to knight f3. We are going to start with the 4 pawns, and this is akin to the Austrian attack, and it has very similar ideas. You could see this pattern against the Pirc, the Modern, the Alechin, I mean, many different openings. White is building this very strong center, Benoni even, but it's very hard to maintain that center. And when I was creating my King's Indian repertoire, I have decided to go into a Benoni. Now this is a point we have to discuss. If you're a King's Indian player, against almost anything other than, say, the classical King's Indian, you will have a choice between playing e5 and c5. And generally King's Indian players like to stick to e5. But I think it's good to remain flexible and accept a Benoni structure if the opportunity arises to get a good Benoni. In this case, against the 4 pawns, I'm going to be recommending a transposition to the Benoni structure. So first we castle, and e5 immediately is not scary at all. e5 doesn't do anything, we can just take. If d5, then queen d1. If fe5, then knight fd7, and the center is absolutely collapsing. We can play f6 on the next move, basically whatever happens. So on castles, white still has to prepare stuff. Now, e5 in this case is an inferior move, I believe. You could go knight a6 or bishop g4, but c5 is very concrete. It's also the main line. So white doesn't have to play d5. They don't have to play d5. They could play dc5. However, this combination of the bishop opening up and the queen coming to a5 is the usual way to play against dc5. So we play queen a5, and now if white is greedy, white just loses the game on the spot. If they take on d6, knight e4, and it's a triple attack on the pawn. So after queen a5, white needs to just keep developing. Bishop d3 saves the pawn because the knight was pinned, and now we recapture with the queen. There's no need to trade queens. So white's going to continue with something like queen e2. We can go knight c6, and now we have a standard Sicilian position. So if you play c5, it's going to be a Benoni or a Sicilian, depending on whether they take or whether you take on d4. Okay, so bishop e3, queen a5. You can also play queen h5, castles, bishop g4 perhaps. It's just a Sicilian position where black has very few issues, and black eventually could try to play for d5. For example, rook ac1, knight d7. Something like queen f2. Knight c5 is now playable. It's not really a King's Indian, but I believe we had no other choice. Okay, so after c5, most players with white who play d4 are not going to take on c5. It's well known that dc5 is inferior for white compared to d5. I myself, since I have been playing e4 for years and I really enjoy the Marozzi-Bind structure against the Sicilian, would consider taking on c5 here. But most people wouldn't. Okay, d5. Now, when you have a pawn on c5 and white advances with d5, the most common way to break open the position is e6 or b5. b5 is playable here, but I believe e6 is the way to go. Now, d6 is playable, definitely, but most people with white are just going to continue developing with bishop e2. So if they take, you could take with the bishop or with the pawn. I prefer taking with the pawn. Something like bishop d3, knight c6, castles, and knight d4. This is a very pleasant square. White should continue with knight g5. White should not take that knight. If knight g5, we can just go e5, solidifying this knight. And after f5, it gets kind of messy, but I think this very stable knight on d4 is, more than enough compensation for a potential kingside attack. And if they take on d4, we play cd4, knight b5. Now you could play e5, and that's the best move, but you can also go knight e8, defending the pawn with the bishop. I really prefer e5 and something like fe5, d5, c5. White's going to have pressure, obviously, down the diagonal, but we do have a protected passed pawn. Now the engine says this is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So I think that's an achievement. Protected passed pawn, nothing major going on. We have lost control over d6, but well, you can't have everything. After e6, most people are not going to take on e6. They're going to continue developing. And now after ed5, cd5, we are in a Benoni. However, we are now in a Benoni in which white has a pawn on f4 and our king has already castled. So there are no tricks with bishop b5 and e5 and all that stuff that usually happens in the f4 Benoni lines. Okay, and as you know, one of the dreams for black in the Benoni is to exchange this bishop. And by exchanging that bishop, we are fighting for control over e5. In the Benoni, and I mean, this video wasn't intended to be on the strategy in the Benoni, but we have to talk about it because sometimes we're forced to play c5. In the Benoni, white plays for e5, black plays for b5. It's as simple as that. If white manages to break through with e5 and then have a passed pawn on the d file, black is almost certainly losing, and the same goes for a successful b5 advance. My last game in the Benoni as white, I played e5 sacrificing a pawn and eventually won because of my passed d pawn. So, bishop g4. We want to exchange the bishop for the knight. Knight d2 may seem interesting, but it doesn't really work because of bishop e2, queen e2, and knight a6. And now after, let's say, castles, rook e8, white's e5 pawn break is no good. d5, fe5, knight d5. White's down a pawn, there's no compensation. On queen f3 we have knight takes c3, queen takes f7, king h8, and our king is perfectly safe despite losing the f-pawn. This is just a trick. You can also go rook e5, by the way. I think knight c3 is better. Queen f7, king h8, bc3, rook e5. It's going to transpose, but I think this is just a clean extra pawn. Queen takes b7 actually runs into knight b4, and that's incredibly dangerous. You can explore these positions further, but this is no longer theory, this is just an idea I wanted to show you. So on bishop g4, knight d2, which is the usual way in the Benoni for white to avoid this trade, does not work. So white's going to castle, and you can go knight bd7 here. I prefer rook e8, immediate pressure on e4, and once again knight d2, no good, so h3 most likely. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3 to defend the pawn, knight bd7. Once again, the key idea is to play against e5. And I think this is a very favorable Benoni for black. I think this is outside of the norm. Something like, let's say, queen c2, queen a5, and b5 is the plan we should go for. Queen a5 puts pressure on the b5 square, and there's no need to prepare it with a6. We also connect the rooks, and all of our pieces are free. As long as we're playing against e5, we are good. So I think in the 4 pawns attack, transposing to this Benoni is by far the best idea. Okay, we are continuing with the Makogonov. So same position, not f4, but h3. Now h3 is a very interesting move, and I have played it in a tournament game once against IM Zdenko Plenković in the Dubrovnik Advent Open last December. My prep was extensive. The idea behind h3 for white is to play g4, and that gives you two possibilities. The first one is to prevent f5, and you're playing against f5. It's as simple as that. The second one, which is more attractive, is knight e2, knight g3, starting a kingside attack. However, when we sat down and reached this position, my opponent did not play the only move I have looked at, castles. And I was really confused, and I kept expecting Mr. Plenković to castle eventually. He did not. Maybe like on move 30 or something. I lost that game, although I was equal, and I didn't lose it because of the opening. I lost it because I blundered. I was actually winning after I blundered at one point, but story for another time. You can find the game in the Road to GM series. So I'm going to recommend exactly what he did, not castling, because h3 makes far less sense if black's king isn't on g8. So instead we're playing knight bd7. Now, white, as I did in the game, oh, one more idea, excuse me, h3 also prevents knight g4, so we can safely play bishop e3 and queen d2. White would normally like to play bishop e3, queen d2, g4, knight e2, knight g3, black's king is on g8, we're just destroying black, there's no f5, and so on and so on. So white plays bishop e3. And now black plays e5. Okay, d5, knight c5. Same idea. We want to go a5, and we want to play against, white's queenside. If white ever castles queenside, for example, okay, now we have to defend e4. You don't really want to go f3. If you play f3 here, that's kind of bad because you weaken all of these squares. Now you have to play knight g2, now your bishop is blocked, now f5 comes, that's no good. So knight c5, queen c2, is standard. You could also go bishop d3, but I'm not sure we want to give away that bishop. And now a5. And I should say that if white castles queenside, the engine says that's fine. It is fine. However, black goes a4. And against Zdenko Plenković, I had this position, and I played b3 eventually to prevent this. But after a4, something like g4, black has a way to fight this advance. Our king has not castled yet, and Zdenko Plenković played this pattern against me. So in the King's Indian, just like in the Benoni, you want to trade this bishop. In the King's Indian, you want to trade the bad King's Indian bishop, unless of course you're able to open up stuff and get rid of the pawn on e5. So the way to play this is to go h5, and this creates a threat. So the first idea, of course, is to play bishop h6. It doesn't work now because we lose a piece, but that's exactly what he managed to do against me. The second idea, if white goes g5, which they should, is knight fd7. And after knight fd7, let's say h4, c6, we now start undermining the center from the side. Of course, if this is taken, we can go bc6, and on rook d6, there's queen c7, and that's more than enough compensation. For example, if rook d2, there's knight e6, and we're going to conquer the d4 square. This is a very famous pattern from the King's Indian. In conjunction with the bishop, the knight on d4 is going to be immune. Why? Because a3 cannot defend the knight, and basically white's king is going to be completely naked. This is very, very good for black. So after queen c2 defending the pawn, black goes a5, and in my opinion, white shouldn't castle. White should continue with g4, but still, what did white achieve? h5, again, same idea, g5, knight fd7, knight f3. Now that the pawn has reached g5, I actually think castling is pretty fine. Castles, say knight d2, king h7, bishop e2. There's no danger for black. There's absolutely no danger. The only way to make progress would be, if this pawn didn't exist, to take on h5, or to perhaps play queen d1 and then take on h5, but that's not going to be enough. It's just not going to be enough. From here we can play many things. I like the plan with knight b8, knight a6 the most, and just playing for the queen side. I think this is a very safe way to play, and it neutralizes the Makogonov. So first of all, the element of surprise of not castling, well, it worked on me, and I think most people would be confused. Okay, moving on, let's have a look at the Averbakh. The Averbakh is interesting. I think it's one of the best ways to play against the King's Indian. So white plays bishop e2, black castles, and bishop e2 is a flexible move that I almost always play. It allows knight f3 the classical, bishop e3 the semi-Averbakh, or bishop g5 the Averbakh. So when you play bishop e2, black still doesn't know what's going to happen. Now the Averbakh is bishop g5. And one of the main ideas behind bishop g5 is to make e5 less good, okay, because of the pin. So most people with black would just continue with c5 or knight a6 and ignore this, but I think forcing the issue with bishop after bishop g5 is very important. h6. First of all, we give white a chance to go badly wrong. Bishop h4 is not a good move. Now neither is bishop f4. So after bishop h4, we can now go c5, and of course if that's taken, once again queen a5. If d5, we now go queen a5, and good luck defending. Okay, I'm threatening to take on e4, have to play queen d2. Now the bishop is completely offside, it's not participating in the attack, and we can safely go a6, knight f3, and b5. Now this should be taken, a b5, and what do you do here? The best move, the only move to not lose immediately, is bishop takes f6. If you, for example, play bishop takes b5, then knight e4. Knight e4, queen b5, and the game is over. So that's the way to punish bishop h4. If bishop f4, then we can safely go knight c6, and we are playing for e5. Knight f3, rook e8. How do you fight against e5? Well, you really don't. In this case, there's even no need to defend the pawn on h6. We can just go e5. If bishop takes h6, then e takes d4. Okay, so bishop f4, no good. After h6, white's best is bishop e3. However, bishop e3, well, you can't really say it's a waste of tempo, but since we're playing for f5, having this pawn on h6 is very useful. And we go e5, white goes d5, we go c6, trying to undermine the center, knight f3, cd, cd. If ed, there's just knight g4, and on bishop d2 there's f5. This is tremendous for black. I mean, slightly better for black according to the engine, but from a human perspective, what does white even do? The bishop is now open. You never really want to play ed because that allows e4 later on. So cd and knight g4. Are you going to move the bishop again? Well, you should. Say bishop c1 and f5. And again, very favorable for black in my opinion. I don't think black is equal here. The engine still says white's better, but after something like knight d2, knight f6, e5, bishop f5, let me put that on the board. Knight d2, knight f6, ef5. There's no need to take with the g-pawn, although you could. I prefer taking with the bishop. Castles, maybe knight a6. I think this is very promising for black. And, you know, we can hope to open up the bishop with e4 if the opportunity arises. I think it's still a bit premature. So I don't think the Averbakh is problematic at all if you play h6, because you're immediately forcing the issue. And then afterwards with e5 and c6 and f5, you're just breaking the center completely. Okay, so same position as before, bishop e2, and now we're going to have a look at the Semi-Averbakh, my favorite opening. So after castles, white goes bishop e3. Now, the reason you play bishop e2 first in the Semi-Averbakh is to cover the g4 square. And I'm going to be making an anti-King's Indian video, a repertoire for white soon, and the Semi-Averbakh is going to be the basis for that. Black has many ways to play against the Semi-Averbakh, and in that video I'm going to be covering, you know, knight c6 and c5 and alternatives to what I'm going to show you now. But today we're going to be looking at what I think is the most irritating setup for black by far. And I just cannot find a decent plan for white if black plays this precisely. So e5, d5, and knight a6. The same position could be achieved with a5 or knight d7, knight bd7 in this position. Our goal is to play knight c5 and a5. Same stuff as always. Now in the Semi-Averbakh, white has two different options, g4, which is what I always play, or h4, which is also playable. We do the same thing against both. Knight c5, queen c2, you have to defend the pawn. But now we can just start undermining with c6. There's really no need to react to the kingside pressure. The engine says b6 is the best move, followed by bishop d7, but c6 is perfectly fine. Now h5, okay, they continued their stuff. And now cd, and bishop d7. I mean, we can also play queen a5, which is okay, and h6. So the reason I never played h4 in the Semi-Averbakh is because I don't really know how to win these positions with white. The main idea is to play against the bad bishop. And white's going to go f3 now, black's going to go knight h5 or bishop d7, say knight h5. This knight should not be taken. Maybe rook b1 or a3, trying to prepare b4. The queen comes back to d8, and technically, black has a dead piece on h8, but I never wanted to play this with white, because it's very counterintuitive. I have no idea where the white king is going to go. And when black inevitably strikes with f5 at some point, what are you going to do? And also after f5, if white takes, then the e-pawn is free to move. If white doesn't take, then this bishop could come out to f6 and to g5. So I'm not really convinced with this. So h4, in my opinion, really isn't scary. That's why I always play g4. And this is the proper Semi-Averbakh system or variation. Okay, knight c5. I should say that bishop c5 is no good. And after bishop c5, dc5, there's this very famous plan of transferring the knight to d6 and just putting pressure on both pawns. It's just no good. Okay, the e4 pawn is attacked, so f3. Okay. From here, I've had black play a5 in most games against me, but that's definitely inferior. a5 allows g5, and a5 allows h4, and a5 allows many different ideas for white. The only really good move here for black is h5. Now, stay with me, it looks crazy, but it makes perfect sense. Firstly, if this is taken, then knight h5 and everything is perfect. If h4, well, that's not scary at all, we can take on g4, and I don't know, if white takes back, e4 is hanging, so, you know, they should throw in b4 and now just gf3 and we're up a pawn. I don't see compensation for the pawn, but okay. So on h5, white should play g5, and we play knight h7. And the plan is to play f6. Now, the pawn is hanging. If white goes queen d2, if they go queen d2, we go f6 anyway. And after g f6, bishop f6, we can safely exchange the bad bishop. And the main thing is we're playing for the f4 square. Almost everyone is going to go h4. And I got this position in my last King's Indian game, in a league game in May. And my opponent played all of this instantly, and then we reached this position, I played h4, and we were both over 90 minutes on the clock. He didn't play f6. He just never played f6. He played f5 50 moves later. And I was confused as to what to do if black doesn't break open the position. So I have been playing against f6 and c6 and everything. He had a pawn on a5. And my opponent just shuffled his pieces around. No one did anything for a while, and then eventually I was much better, but I didn't know how to convert. I couldn't find the plan. Then he broke out with f5, was much worse, but then I blundered and lost. So black doesn't have to play f6 technically. However, there's going to be nothing for you to do. My opponent literally played bishop e8, bishop d7, bishop f8, bishop e7 for 20 moves. So we play f6. And the idea is, we want to play for the f4 square. Firstly, if this isn't taken, if queen d2, then we take on g5. And after hg5, we go rook f4. Okay, this rook should not be taken. If the rook is taken, black is better. Queen f4, knight g5, the bishop is alive. Where is the white king going? You castle queenside, I go bishop e5, followed by queen f6. Very dangerous. Not losing for white, but from a human perspective, much, much worse. So on queen d2, we play this idea with rook f4, and white should continue with b4 and play very actively. Knight a6, maybe a3 or rook b1. We can now take on g5, and white is technically equal, but this rook on f4 kills all of white's play on the king side. Now, on f6, queen d2 is an inferior move. Most people are going to take on f6. We recapture with the bishop. The threat is to take the pawn. So bishop f2, and also take the pawn with check. Okay, and bishop e7, the key move. The idea, once again, is to play rook f4. Now rook f4 not only kills all counterplay, but it also puts triple pressure on the pawn. Okay, queen d2, white's trying to castle, rook f4. Now there's no way to defend the pawn. There's not much you can do. So castles. So we take. We're up a pawn. Bishop e3. We don't move the rook away. There's no need to move the rook away. We go bishop f6. Same idea. Once again, white should go b4. And when they go b4, then knight a6, a3, we have rook h4, saving the rook. If they take with bishop f4, we play ef4. And I shouldn't really be explaining that queen takes is completely losing because of bishop g5. So, that doesn't work. If you play something else, I don't know, maybe, knight h3, we can eliminate the knight. Rook takes h3, bishop e5, very pleasant position. The engine actually prefers black significantly. And the fact that we're down an exchange doesn't really matter at all, because we're playing for a6 and b5 and breaking through to the white king. And also because the rook, well, either rook is really not better than this bishop. And furthermore, white's bishop on e2 is just bad. It's just a bad piece. So that's the Semi-Averbakh. That's my antidote as black, and that's what I hope I will not see as white when I play the Semi-Averbakh. On to the Fianchetto. Something slightly different now. White does not play knight c3. White plays knight f3, and after bishop g7 they play g3. Okay. Castles, bishop g2, d6. We do the same thing. White castles. And now there are many moves. You can play knight c6, knight bd7, c6, c5, a6, bishop f5. There are literally 10 moves that are playable here. I like c6. c6 is a double-purpose move. Firstly, it strengthens the center, and secondly, it allows queen a5. And queen a5, I think, is one of the main ideas here. one of the best main ideas here. b3 is a playable move, but we still go queen a5. And after bishop b2, we go queen h5. That's our main resource. Moving the queen to the king side, trying to start the king side attack, preventing h3, and offering a queen trade if e4 is played and if the knight moves. So against c6, most people are going to play knight c3. We go queen a5. White has many moves here. h3 is the second most popular. And h3 I don't think is a particularly good move. There's no need to play queen h5 here because g4, of course, but we have bishop e6. And now d5 is playable to save that weakness. cd, knight d4 is the main move. You don't really want to play cd because that loses a pawn. So knight d4, bishop d7, they take on d5, something like rook c8. I think this is very pleasant. It's just a symmetrical pawn structure, and with this pawn reaching d5, this bishop has been blunted, and our bishop, of course, is very much alive, so this is equal. The best move is, I think, knight d2. And now there are many moves. You can go queen a6, trying to put additional pressure on the pawn, but I actually like knight a6. And after e4, still queen h5. And if g4 is played here, that's just no good. We can just take it. This is a very, very famous pattern, bishop g4. Probably bishop f3, but now f5. And we have more than enough counterplay for the piece. Firstly, we have two pawns, but after something like e5, g5, bishop g4, fg4, the position is opening up in our favor, and we can eventually play ideas like knight c7, e6, f4, or rook f3, because there's an outpost provided by the g4 pawn, and it's just a ton of counterplay. So queen b3 is better than g4, I think. Now it gets a bit complicated. Now we're technically out of theory. Our b7 pawn is hanging, but I just wanted to show you queen b3 because of the pattern with b5. This pawn is pinned, and, you know, white cannot take on b5. So this is the type of position you can expect. I think it's very probable that white at some point is going to lash out with g4. Whenever they do, for example here, we just take it. And knight g4. Now you have to defend against mate, so something like knight f3. This is another famous pattern. We can take on d4, the pawn is free. However, the bishop has moved, so the b pawn is hanging. But now we have knight c5, and it gets very complicated. These are the types of tactics you can expect in the Fianchetto with queen a5, queen h5. And I think they slightly favor black. Okay, now the Samisch. So our typical King's Indian position with knight c3 and white plays f3. The Samisch has two different positions, with knight c3 and without knight c3. The reason I mentioned that is very important. In my last King's Indian game, actually, in the Pula Open, I played the Samisch without knight c3, which we're going to have a look at in a second. And the idea is that you want one knight, the g1 knight on c3, and the b1 knight on a3, and both knights are playing against b5. And technically, if you don't play knight c3 but play f3 first, that's called the anti-Grunfeld. It also transposes to the modern defense. The Samisch with knight c3 is different. So black castles, bishop e3. White's idea, of course, is to castle queenside and destroy black. Okay, you want to go g4 and, you know, all of your pawns are moving forward. If black does nothing, that is going to work. And we're also preparing to play against f5 as white if we manage to play g4. This is going to resemble a Dragon Sicilian a lot. Let's imagine that these two pawns have been traded. This is a very typical Dragon Sicilian, Yugoslav attack, or the English attack. I always mix those two up. So it's pretty much the same idea. f3 prevents knight g4, so allows bishop e3, and begs for a kingside pawn storm. Okay, c5. Going into a Sicilian dragon. If this is taken, we once again have queen a5. Knight g2, white's developing, knight c6, and d5. Knight e5. This pattern we're going to see in the Samisch without knight c3 as well, except that the knight would be on b1, as we're going to see, and white plays knight ec3 to defend the c4 pawn with the bishop. In this case, you cannot do that. You have to move the knight somewhere else. I should say b3 loses straight away to like here, and you're busted. So you have to defend, so you play knight g3. And there are several ways for black to play this, but I like the most straightforward h5. And I think this gives black more than equality. I actually love black in these positions, and while I was preparing for my tournament game, I actually texted Mate, who's a FIDE master. He used to be my coach, and he's a friend of mine, saying, you know, I need something against the King's Indian. And he sent over the Samisch without knight f3, and he said, I think this is still relevant, I think this is still good, so I played that. And I remember trying to make the normal Samisch work with knight c3, but I couldn't because of this idea of h5. Okay, white should continue developing. h4. The knight moves to f1, and now just e6, and the center is crumbling. This is very tough to play. Let's say knight d2. If they try to reroute the knight, then ed, cd, and h3. What do you do? g3? This is very tough. Black is better even according to the engine. a6, b5 is coming. Where's the white king going? This looks incredibly dangerous. So on e6, black really should play bishop g5, trying to pin that knight. But you can unpin with queen b6, queen d2 defends the pawn, ed5, maybe bishop f6, knight d5. Now we have to defend the bishop, so queen d8, knight takes, queen takes. The other knight's going to be coming to d5, but we can plant the knight on d4. And I think this is, it's a very rich position. Let's say castle's queenside, knight d4. Both sides have a weakness to work with. There's a hole on d4 and there's a hole on d5. But black is by no means worse. And of course our main plan is still to go a6, b5, and so I really think this idea with h5, h4 plays against the Samisch with knight c3 perfectly. Now against h5, bishop e2 seems to be the only reasonable move. h4, if they try to prevent you from moving forward, we can just switch plans to either e6 or a6. I like a6. Say queen d2, bishop d7, and we're playing for b5. If they play a4, queen a5, very natural position. So white is going to have to continue developing. There's no way to prevent h4 easily. Okay, the anti-Grunfeld. So the Samisch without knight c3. White goes f3 straight away. And Grunfeld players, well, they would want to play d5 here. Some people do. Some people go into the King's Indian. But the main idea is if they go d5, then cd, knight d, and e4 without the trade being possible on c3. So that's why it's called the anti-Grunfeld. The King's Indian players play bishop g7. And now we're going to get the same position, except that the knight isn't on c3. So d6, bishop e3, we avoid knight c3 as white, queen d2, and black has e5 and c5 here. I think c5 is better. So c5, knight e2. White does not react. And the idea is to play knight ec3 and knight a3. We play knight c6, d5. Now, in one training game against Daniel, he played knight a5 against me. And when I played Kachavi Dana, an Israeli FIDE master, she played knight a5 as well. And I had really good prep against it. I lost both games. I was better in both games. So both moves are playable, and they have the same idea. But knight e5, I think, is stronger. Okay, they both attack the pawn on c4. Knight ec3 defending the pawn. And both Daniel and Dana played a6 against me. a6 is a fine move. It's okay. But e6 is stronger straight away. So we are going to go e6 here. Okay, now white can continue developing with bishop e2, or white can take that pawn. White may get tempted to take the pawn and put pressure on d6, and this is the main reason I love this variation for white. So takes, bishop takes, and knight a3, and now we are transposing to the same position I reached against both of them. We had this position. Oh, excuse me, I think Daniel may have recaptured with the f-pawn, but I'm not sure. Dana definitely took with the bishop. And once we reached this position, I had white, I played rook d1, and she immediately played queen b6. So after rook d1, queen b6, this pawn is immune. And if you take that pawn, of course, b2 is hanging. So I continued with bishop e2, and she defended the pawn, and so on and so on. And it's a perfectly playable position for black. Excuse me, she had a knight on a5, of course. The knight was not on e5. Now, the reason I like having a knight on e5 as opposed to a knight on a5 is the following lines. After a6, should white choose to castle, black is winning. And I think it's more winning because the knight is on e5, because it's not blocking access to the a5 square for the queen or for the rook. b5. And now what do you do? Your knights are hanging. I want to go b4, so you have to take. Okay. Once again, your knights are hanging. You have to take the pawn. If you take with the a knight, bishop a2. If you take with the c knight, then d5 is devastating. Look at the white king. And I think the only reasonably playable move is bishop takes, but this loses all the same. Rook takes a3, b takes a3, queen a5, and now you see why the knight isn't on a5. And after this, I don't even know what to suggest for white. If you play something like a4, trying to defend the pawn, then knight c4, and it's hopeless. So after bishop e6, knight a3, a6, white can play rook d1, and that's fine. But I can also continue developing with bishop e2. And if they play bishop e2, we can now just go knight c6 and play for the d4 square, or the b4 square. So let's say castles, knight d4. This should not be taken. If it's taken twice, queen takes d4, then of course knight takes e4, and it's busted. On queen takes e4, there's queen b6 check, and king h1, queen takes, well, king h1, queen takes b2. These are the tactics that often work in these lines. So we can get away with knight d4, and again, it should not be taken. Let's say rook a d1, knight d7, now we defend, and we have d4 under our full control. So the Samisch without knight c3 remains one of my favorite lines for white, but I think black is absolutely fine if they know what they're doing. Finally, we're going to have a look at two pretty minor sidelines. One of them is knight g2, the Kramer variation. This isn't a problem at all. The idea is knight g3, but we're going to treat this the same way we played against the Samisch with knight c3. If there's a knight on g3, h5, and you know, that's it. So castles, knight g3, h5. It's as simple as that. h4 is no good. It gives away the g4 square, and we can once again strike with c5, c5, d5, either knight to d7. I like knight b d7. Now we have access to two very strong squares. Something like bishop e2, knight e5 is very strong for black. I think h4 is too weakening. So on h5, bishop e2, h4, knight f1. This is all still theory. And now there are many moves you could go for. Most people play h3. I think that's unreasonably risky. I prefer e5. And after e5, if d5, d5, queen d8, rook d8, bishop g5, then we play h3. And if they go d5, then we go knight h7, and we play for f5. And something like bishop e3, f5, again, is very strong for black. White really should take, and then the bishop has been liberated, and our king is no less safe because the pawn is on h4. Okay, so that's the Kramer. And finally, bishop d3. Bishop d3, I don't think it even has a name. The idea is, of course, knight g2 without blocking in the bishop, but no problems at all. Knight g2, knight c6. We play this like a relatively normal King's Indian, castles, e5, d5, and knight d4. Now, this doesn't have to be taken. I don't think it should be taken. If bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, c5, great. And if it is taken, then we take knight e2 attacking the pawn. We can go rook e8. I think that's perfectly playable. If rook e8 and knight takes, that fails to knight e4, of course. And after rook e8, if f3, threatening knight d4, then we go c5. If dc6, bc6, and we're absolutely fine. After bishop g5, we once again go h6. I think this is borderline unplayable for white compared to the main lines or the better lines we had a look at previously. So again, not an issue. I hope you enjoyed the repertoire. Let me know what you think. I know that I had a lot of fun preparing this. If there are holes in the repertoire, and there surely are, if there are mistakes, and there must be some, please let me know in the comments, and I'm going to continue working on this. Once again, the repertoire is available below. Stay tuned for more chess, and thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.